Welcome to Salad with a Side of Fries. I'm your host, Jenn Trepeck, talking wellness and weight loss for real life. We're here to clear up the myths, misinformation, bad science, and marketing to teach you how to eat and how to cheat. Are you ready? I'm having salad with a side of fries. This week, we're talking about tears. So it turns out there is more to tears than you probably realize. And you may be wondering where this is even coming from. So a few months ago, a friend said to me, I need a good cry. And it was maybe like 3 days later, there was that terror attack on my temple. And I had that good cry, like tears, a lot of them. And it felt like they would come at the drop of a hat. And I remember then it was like a couple days after that where I saw the same friend again. And I was like, hey, remember when you said that thing of like, you needed a good cry? And then I even started crying as I said it, and I told her the story. And it's interesting because when I think about that scenario now, I'm also reminded of years ago when I rarely cried. It's quite a contrast. So years ago, I was working in hedge funds. I had my health coaching practice on the side, and my boyfriend at the time and we were watching a movie, and he cried. I didn't. And he was like, I think you're broken. So all of this like came to mind again recently when I saw this thing on Instagram about tears, and I knew we had to talk about it together. So some of this goes back to research from like the 1980s out of the University of Minnesota. So there was a biochemist who compared tears caused by onions, like cutting onions, like that onion vapor, and tears caused by sadness. And what he found was that in the chemical makeup of those tears, they are dramatically different. The tears from the onion are like 98% water. The tears from sadness, also mostly water, but also had stress hormones. Specifically, there's one called ACTH, which stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone, and another called Leucine Enkephalin. I'm probably saying it wrong. And that one has an analgesic effect, or like a pain numbing effect. And then there are also neurotransmitters in there. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter found in emotional tears. Catecholamine neurotransmitters like adrenaline and noradrenaline are also in emotional tears. And what we take from this is that I sort of think of tears as, or I guess crying, as detoxifying. Like the hormones found in tears are essentially the waste product of nervous system activity. So further research, it reveals that there's really 3 different types of tears, and each type has usually about 3 layers. And so there's a lot to this. I think for today's conversation, the piece that's most interesting are those 3 types of tears. So let's go through those. So there's basal, reflex, and emotional. So basal tears, think of these like the eye's function and lubrication. So they serve to protect and nourish the cornea. And they also have like antibacterial properties based on the enzymes that are in them. And they're produced by glands like beneath the eyelids. Reflex tears are like the ones caused by that onion, or if you're near a grill or a bonfire and there's smoke and you have, your eyes start to water. So reflex tears are a defense mechanism, and they protect the eye from irritants or like physical damage. So both of these types of tears are mostly water and some proteins. Like I said, there's some enzymes. So lysozyme has a higher concentration in tears than in any other body fluid. It's like 20 to 30% of the protein in basal and reflexive tears. So fun facts for you. Okay, then emotional tears, though, this is the 3rd type. These are triggered not by the eye, but by the brain. And specifically in the brain, it's the limbic system. So the limbic system is our emotional processing in the brain. And the biochemistry of the emotional tears is dramatically different than basal and reflective tears. And we went through already some of the biochemistry that's in these emotional tears. What's also interesting is that
these emotional tears are uniquely human. So even other animals that express emotions and grief, they don't cry. And one of the interesting pieces about emotional tears is that their release allows the parasympathetic nervous system to activate. So parasympathetic is rest and digest. So our heart rate slows down, our breathing slows down. We talked about this actually in our Sonobi breathing nutrition nugget and even in our triggers episode, that with a stress response, so that's your sympathetic nervous system, with that stress response, we have to move through this cycle. Crying, the physical release of these emotional tears are one way that we can move through that stress cycle to go through the sympathetic and allow the parasympathetic to turn back on. So this is also kind of interesting because if you or your littles cry and then feel exhausted or you end up falling asleep, that's the cycle completing. And I think it's also interesting to think about holding back tears or suppressing that emotion. Now, this reminds me of that time, when I didn't cry at that movie. I think I was living in a place where being in touch with some of those emotions wasn't serving me in my career. And so I just sort of lived in a world where I just didn't feel those things. And so, over the last 7 years since leaving that job, really coming back to myself, those emotions are turned back on again. I can feel them. So one of the pieces of this is when we suppress the expression of emotion, when we don't cry or we hold back those tears, it can keep us stuck in that stress response in the body. For some people, this ends up looking like tension, like muscle tension, difficulty sleeping, headaches, feeling like something's just not quite right. But you can't quite put your finger on it either. It could be a tight jaw or jaw tension, chest pressure. There may be even other symptoms too. And so for some of this, it can really, this idea of suppressing these emotions, not letting the crying or those tears help us move through the stress response and through the stress cycle. We're stuck and we have these other feelings, and then we can turn it to other numbing agents like food or alcohol or doom scrolling, as the case may be. So crying serves a function for us in our health pretty dramatically. And then I think there's also a social function to tears. So I mentioned this, uniquely human piece of, emotional tears. And in nature, and think about caveman times, the tears would signal to other members of your group that maybe there was, a danger. Or even today, when you see someone with tears on their face, we instinctually have this feeling of wanting to help. And that's not just anecdotal. There is research that shows that seeing tears triggers that kind of a response for us as humans. And so all of this to say is that tears, when held in, also deprive us of this. Well, I guess not even when they're held in, but even just tears only shed in private can deprive us of this connection aspect of showing emotion. And then on one more level of health, we talked about this in our episode with Dr. Joey. We talked about how much the eyes can tell us about what's happening inside the body in real time while we're awake. So basal tears can become a biomarker. If we look at the volume of each protein in the basal cells, it can offer insight into the function of the immune system, which I think is just fascinating as we look at all these different kinds of biomarkers, especially ones that are non-invasive. So then the last question that often comes up is, what about tears of joy versus tears of sadness? And this definitely requires more research, but I did find one study, and tears of joy have different metabolites than tears of sadness. So they said, and I'm just quoting it here, it says, secretion of negative emotional tears was associated with some synapses in the brain, regulation of a series of endocrine hormones, including the estrogen signaling pathway and inflammation activities, while secretion of positive emotional tears was correlated with biotin and caffeine metabolism. So I think it's interesting. I'd be curious to see more research on the tears of joy piece of it. But there you have it, my friend. I think the bottom line is we don't need to hide our tears. We don't need to apologize for them, and know that they are truly serving our health, frankly, on every level, like physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, all the ways. Well, as always, everybody, I'm your host, Jenn Trepeck. Connect with me on Instagram or all social media. I'm at Jenn Trepeck, JENNTREPECK. Website is asaladwithasideofries.com. Pick your platform, send a message. I love hearing from you, your ideas, your takeaways, your questions. This is also the easiest way to learn more about working with me as your coach. Dr. Alexandra Geyer, thank you again one more time for joining us this week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And friends, if you're not already, join us in the Happy Healthy Hub. You'll go to asaladwithasideofries.com/membership. This shows your support for this podcast, this community, and above all, your health. You'll get this week's episode in full video with some behind the scenes pieces, your 24/7 Ask Me Anything on the community board, and this week's recipe for grilled steak salad with corn, cucumbers, and sweet onion dressing.
Well, friends, that's it for today's episode of Salad with a Side of Fries. Congratulations for making yourself and your health a priority. Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to click subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast platform. Share us with a friend, and we'll be back next week. Always remember, you deserve it, and you are worth it. Happy healthy.